"Scott, just look," exclaimed Eva. Scott looked up from his book and turned his attention to his wife, Eva. She held a strange-looking doll in her hands, with messy hair and a smudged face covered in who knows what. Cracks were visible in some places, and two large teeth protruded from its mouth, resembling human teeth. The torn and crumpled clothing, tiny limbs with crooked fingers. The doll seemed to have escaped from a horror movie, the kind where such toys are made to be as terrifying and grotesque as possible to instill fear. "It's not very pretty," Scott replied, trying to soften his response. "You don't understand anything," Eva said, holding the doll tightly against her. "Yeah, sure." It had been a year since their 5-year-old son disappeared. They took their eyes off him for a moment as he ran off to see something in the park. They realized it a couple of minutes later, but he seemed to have vanished. They searched the park with the help of the police and posted missing posters everywhere, but they never found their son. "Aren't you happy? Our little one has returned." "Of course, dear. I'm very happy." Eva stared at her husband intently, stroking the doll. Scott returned to his book. Losing their son had caused him immense pain, but resorting to such extremes was not his way of coping. It only made things worse, reopening an old wound, and the thought that his beloved wife had lost her mind made the situation even more unpleasant. "You're not happy, Scott. Deep down, you don't really care." He didn't pay attention as she left the room, simply listening to the loud footsteps and sobs. Then came the sound of the door slamming shut, and silence. Scott put down his book and closed his eyes. There were no tears left, but he wanted to cry. Soon, he would lose his wife as well. A week later, Eva finally emerged from the room, still holding the doll close to her. Scott tried not to look at the eerie replacement for their son. They peacefully discussed their plans for the weekend. Summer was in full swing. Why not have a picnic? They hadn't been out in nature in a while, and it would be refreshing to escape the city hustle. Scott wanted to mention the doll but decided not to bring it up. He didn't want to upset his wife again. Perhaps she would grow tired of it eventually, and everything would return to normal. At least, Scott hoped so. When the weekend came, they gathered together. Scott, Eva, and their son. It was a rather strange sight. The couple laughed, talked, enjoyed delicious food as one would at a picnic, but a creepy-looking doll sat next to them, observing. It watched the happy couple, the birds, and the small animals. It listened to their conversations, the singing and the rustling of the grass. It sensed the moments of the wind. The doll seemed alive, or pretended to be. Life gradually improved. Eva found solace in the doll. Scott no longer found his beloved's behavior irritating and even played along with her, interacting with the son. This was happiness. The family was complete, if one could consider it that way, and life no longer seemed so bleak. But it was only the beginning. Just as everything seemed to be getting better, another calamity struck. Eva started to weaken. Each day her condition worsened. Scott even took time off work to be with his ailing wife. Doctors shrugged their shoulders, prescribing medications that did little to help Eva recover. Throughout this time, the doll remained by her side. It observed her suffering, and it was the only thing keeping Eva somewhat sane and connected. Scott was grateful for that. At least his beloved clung to life. Soon, Eva began to hallucinate. She called out for their son, shouting and groaning. In those moments, her body contorted. It was then that Scott noticed something strange on his wife's body. Above her belly button was a perfectly round wound, covered in a hard flesh crust that pulsed slightly. Scott cautiously touched the wound, but his wife instantly stopped him, gripping his wrist tightly, which surprised him. Eva momentarily returned to normal, giving Scott a menacing look and whispered through clenched teeth, "Don't touch." Then her skin returned to its sickly appearance, and she looked unwell. Scott couldn't believe what had just happened. His instincts told him that something was definitely not right. Now life resembled a horror movie. Scott quit his job and spent entire days at home, all in an effort to bring his wife back. She was no longer the Eva he knew. She had become deranged, emaciated, and gray like someone plagued by illness, a pitiful semblance of a human being. And that doll. Eva never parted with it, not even for a second. Scott tried to take the horrifying toy away, but Eva wouldn't allow it. It was too late to attempt to get rid of the doll. Scott didn't want to seek help from any specialists. He wasn't ready to admit that what was happening defied any human explanation. Perhaps his instincts were deceiving him. Maybe it was all just a terrible dream. If only. Scott had already given up. He was lost, unsure of what to do. And he himself gradually turned into a pitiful semblance of a human being, because since the beginning of these events, he had started drinking. Cheap booze became the only solution to all his problems. Soon it would run out too, as the budget wasn't infinite for indulging in alcohol. At times, they would gather together, Scott, Eva, and the son, reminiscing about the good old days. They sat in the living room, in complete silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The lights had long been off, and there was hardly any food left. Empty bottles, excrement, and vomit were the only remnants. The smell of urine had become so stagnant that it served as an air freshener. Eva played with the son, telling him various stories, while Scott paid no attention. He had forgotten that he was not alone. During one of these gatherings, Scott noticed something peculiar. When he looked at the doll, it seemed to him that it was sprouting something resembling flesh. Not exactly. The plastic or whatever material the doll was made of was crumbling, revealing raw flesh underneath. Even the black eyes had fallen off, replaced by real, human-like eyes of a dull color. Teeth became visible, and the hair noticeably grew. The doll itself had grown slightly larger. Ironically, Scott did not react to this at all. He attributed it to his excessive drinking, believing that the dolls were transforming into real children. One fine day, Scott heard very strange sounds that woke him up from his sleep, as if someone was greedily sucking the remnants of juice. Scott decided to check if it was just his imagination. He grabbed a nearby chair as a form of protection and cautiously entered the living room. The sounds were coming from his wife's room. Approaching the room, Scott pressed his ear against the door. His hand slowly reached for the doorknob. Applying slight pressure, he opened the door and stormed into the room, ready for an attack. However, the chair slipped from his hands. The very same doll was sitting on Eva, sucking the life out of her with its long proboscis, like a mosquito. The flesh pulsated, excreting a transparent slime. The doll's murky eyes darted around the room until they fixated on Scott, who had just entered. The proboscis detached from his wife's body, revealing a grotesque fusion of fly and human, and it let out a loud screech, leaping in place. "Now it's your turn, Daddy. I hope you're just as delicious."